Um, Ironically, I did not start this trajectory as a child. I wanted to do 8,000 things as a child. And it wasn't until I was in college and taking anthropology classes that I started to think about identity and the way in which identity comes to be imposed on us. And I think I was particularly interested in gender and, how do gender identities come to be constructed and imposed on us. And it was just a completely kind of, I'm not sure what led me to think about archaeology as an alternative to doing more broadly sort of ethnographic approaches in sociocultural anthropology, which was my first sort of interest. But I think it was because I just have an interest in history in general, and so I went on a field school, my first field school. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. There's just something about the combination of thinking through dirt that makes me really happy, and being able to sort of analyze the material remains of our lives. And that's, in a way, this really sees my interest in terms of identity, because that materiality of how we construct identity is done in a way that is very often completely subconscious. So the kinds of stories, or the way that we construct ourselves through the material world comes through in a very different way than the kinds of things that you see in written historical documents. And I was just fascinated by that contrast. And so I started through professional training as an archaeologist and did a master's degree at UMass Boston, and which was in a joint program in history and historical archaeology, and worked on a thesis there, and got involved in doing various different projects. The project that ended up being my ultimate dissertation project, which was at Sylvester Manor in Shelter Island, New York, was one that challenged all of those stories that we learned through histories in just so many different ways that it was astonishing to me that this was some place that was the estate itself on Shelter Island was established as a provisioning plantation. And we knew from the documents that they were employing is the wrong word, that they had enslaved African laborers as part of the plantation workforce. And this just flies in the face of every story you hear about slavery. It's not supposed to happen in the North, and so on and so forth. So what we came to find out also was that the labor force also included Native people. Also something that really eludes the archives, and it certainly eludes the popular historical perception of plantation life in colonial America. So at that point, my approach, I had started down the road as an archaeologist with this idea that, how great I can look at the minutia of daily life by looking through people's garbage, essentially. To think about how identity is constructed in very sort of unconscious ways or subconscious ways, rather than the very conscious representation that we make of ourselves. And it was a big puzzle for me. And now all of a sudden the puzzle came to include not just what was in the ground, but what are those stories that are around us all the time. We often think as academic historical scholars of, that what we do is in opposition to stories, but I came to think of it in terms of negotiating between or mediating between all the stories that are out there. And so that's kind of how I view things now in my work, is as a university teacher, I could keep sort of digging up sites and telling alternative stories about what happened there. But I actually find it more compelling to bring more people into the picture and allow them to tell the story in as many different ways as they find that they need to, and to think about why those stories do certain kinds of work for them, and how kind of introducing people to different archives, and we could think about the archaeological record as an archive in that respect also. What they can do with that material to tell a story about not only the past, but about who they think they are today. And so that's what launched me into this current phase of my work, which is trying to devise new educational opportunities for students, but also to work with communities on, how can we collaboratively make those stories out of every sort of shred of material evidence that's out there, draw on all the different perspectives that we can, and think about why these stories do certain kinds of work for us. And where do they come in conflict with other stories? How do we mediate that? So part of it is about the dirt, which I still retain a great love for, and part of it is about those stories themselves, I think. And I hope that's not gotten too abstract, but you're making me try to conceptualize this trajectory in a way that I hadn't quite done before. So that's I think that's really how I came to this point anyway.
Was the impulse to do what you're doing in any way personal, or was it, as you've kind of characterized it so far, a bit at a distance from yourself? I mean, I can imagine people, say, living in one of the great houses of England with, relics of 600 years round about, and portraits of Aunt Tilly, who would have been queen except for that. Building stories, hearing stories built, and being kind of caught in the crossfire. I suppose the current heirs to the British throne are caught in that crossfire. Was there a sense in which this was a personal quest for you?
In a way, but in a backhanded way, which is, family history has always been very important to my family. I always knew a great deal about my family history. It's not particularly exciting, but I knew it. It was important in my family. But I never realized quite what a privilege that is, and the kind of place that puts me in, the sort of social place that puts me in, to have that privilege to know my history to the extent that I do, until I started thinking about these other stories that I was, in some cases literally digging up, and realizing that the transmission of that history is not necessarily a sort of commonly held thing. I mean, I always use the example of when looking at potentially traumatic histories, for example, we could think about all the various reasons why people remain silent about those histories, and a few generations down the line, it's just a blank slate. And so these become, access to those histories becomes a real privilege, and something that I feel strongly that everybody should be able to engage in, to be able to utilize all of the resources around them, to know themselves in a historical sense. The part of, and the other aspect of it being personal to me is, there's a real deep-seated anger that I learned as I was doing some of the research that I've done. And one of the greatest sources of that is when, again, looking at Sylvester Manor in New York and thinking about why is it that plantation histories, popular renditions of plantation histories never sort of talk about northern slavery, but they also never really talk about the involvement of Native people in these histories. and realized that it was not just about that colonial history, but it was about all of the subsequent things that happened, particularly in the 19th century. We could think about to Native people that wipes out their access. One of them being, the Dawes Allotment Act, which requires Native people to be enrolled in particular tribes so that their reservation lands could be chopped up and distributed to them. And what essentially, and actually a sort of parallel to this is Jim Crow laws at the end of the 19th century, what each of these kinds of federal policies did to people at the time was force them to declare themselves to be one thing and one thing only. It denies the plurality and the complexity of people's histories. Declaring yourself to be Native, particularly today, if one is a tribe is pursuing federal tribal recognition, forces them to adhere to a particular kind of story about themselves. They're forced to defend their own identities in a way that most white Americans don't have to, never had to do, and have no understanding of what that must mean to them to defend their own histories, their own senses of selves in that way. And that made me incredibly angry, and it made me want to push back on the kinds of popular histories that don't acknowledge those kinds of complexities that most people have to, not most people, certain communities, certain populations in this country have to deal with on a routine basis, but we ignore it or we soft sell it or something like this. I want people to know about those things. I want people to recognize that that there is this inherent complexity and we need to account for it, and realize that not everybody has the sort of same rights to have as weird and messy and complex a history as they want. So I guess it came around, that sort of personal sense came around in very odd ways, and maybe structured the way I do things now pretty strongly. So
yeah, I can imagine you having a choice as you're working as an archaeologist. I mean, to keep sort of making the artifacts available and suggesting how they seem to link up as raw material for processing by all sorts of people who might want to then go on to tell stories. And one could presumably do a lot more digging and have a lot more time with one's hands in the dirt if one went that way. Say, okay, I dig it up. You figure it out. I'll write about what it seems to say. You tell me where I get it wrong. And you seem to have taken a different tack, which is to redirect a serious portion of your energy to this matter of interpretation, and to the fact that if I lay it all out on this table, people will tell different stories. I'm wondering how that came about for you, this focus, this sort of move to the oral history end of the story, as opposed to this possibility of a lifetime being a mole.
Right. Well, when one opts to be a historical archaeologist, generally speaking, working on sites that date to the more recent past, there's almost no avoiding the fact that people always show up at archaeological sites anyway, because people just love archaeology. They're fascinated by it. But there's a different kind of an approach when one's working on a more recent site, which is people have a very personal connection to it. So they're going to tell you one way or the other, what they think about the site, whether you want them to or not. And at first, when I was first sort of getting into the work, I thought, well, I really don't want them to tell me because I know what I'm doing. But then I came around and realized that, sometimes people are speaking from what their assumptions are about the past, but very often, if you listen closely, they are telling you something that you didn't know and that make you understand the site in a completely different way. every archaeologist has come up with the artifact where it's like, if this is clearly a human-made artifact, but I have no idea what it is. But if you show it to everybody who comes through, somebody might be able to tell you what it is. And it brings you a sort of humility about your work, which is to say, none of us are in a position to understand all of this stuff. And so the best interpretations that we're going to be able to come up with are the ones that invite as much engagement as possible. But it also, particularly if we're talking about archaeology of native sites, there's something also peculiar about this, which is very often people just assume that the archaeology of Native American sites is about the ancient past, and that's dead history in a way, and it's not. It's really not. So I can't even say that this is an issue of being a historical archaeologist, because many archaeologists who work in the pre-colonial past in the United States are having the same reaction from Native communities with whom they are collaborating, who can tell them an awful lot about what they're digging up, because that's their, that's within their oral tradition, it's within their oral history, and again, there's that sort of realization that we cannot objectively know or analytically discover everything about what's there, and we would be stupid to ignore the interpretations, the stories that people are offering us, and not just offering us, but sort of demanding that they be heard, and I think that's right, So I think one of the things that has changed the most about archaeology in general, which is kind of interesting, is that it was at one time public archaeology would be, you go out, you dig up the site, you do all the analysis, you write the report, and then you have an event that you invite people in and hear about. So you tell them what you found. What we've realized now is that at that point, it's just way too late. You need to listen to what people are telling you before you even open that site up, because they may be able to tell you something that completely changes the approach that you take to the site. The areas that you're looking in, even the kinds of features that you're looking for, the material culture that you're looking for, it can actually have very often has a positive impact on your research design, not just your interpretations after the fact. So yeah, it's sort of radically changed the way that archaeology is done in this country, I think.
I was remembering, as you're talking, an example from my Facebook feed recently. For some reason, someone outfitted a kitchen in the early 1950s and then never occupied the house. Mm-hmm. So it's pristine, with the instruction booklet still taped to the appliances. The thing is done entirely in Mamie Eisenhower pink. And so there's the discussion of the importance of Mamie Eisenhower pink as a post-war phenomenon and so forth. It's every so often you even going back a little further, you get lucky like that. You open not just a bunch of dirty stuff, but the clean stuff.
Right, yeah.
Or, as in Germany, people have a reason to clean it up. And so you sort of get to see what a Baroque church looked like before it got dirty. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Some people talk about that as the Pompeii premise, right? That what we really want is the context sealed without anybody's chance to alter it in any way, I mean, if you're looking at a site and it's been, it's a house that has been abandoned or something like that, presumably people have packed before they abandon it, right? So you're only going to get a certain portion of it, but that, the house at the moment when it's been finished, and is pristine, and then Pompeii happens, buries it in situ. That's what people kind of, sometimes people wistfully think, well, that would be great if we got that, but we never get that. So, almost never get that.
Well, what's so striking when you see something like that is how gleaming it is.
Right.
And when you walk into a kitchen where everything gleams, you have the sense, it must have been quite a lot of fun to be in this kitchen for years. I mean, like the new car smell.
Right.
You know, if you liked pink,
Right.
it was like a new world.
Mm.
And that's awfully hard to recover.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a matter not so much of the facts as of the values, of the weight of the facts.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I wonder if you run into that. I mean, not so much what this gadget is or what this implement is, but
Mm-hmm.
how people felt about this implement. You know, what it was to go down to the stables at 5 a.m. to feed the horses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's the part that I think that people often forget, and I try to impress on students in particular, which is there are the dry and boring facts about we went to this site, we recovered 18 nails and 47 pieces of potsherds and this and that. And here's the laundry list of what we have, and those are the facts. Those are the pieces of evidence. But the reality is as anthropologists, not just archaeologists, but as anthropologists, we're not there for the facts. We're there, what we're really there for to try and understand is human practices and behavior. And by definition, the sites that we go to, that's the one thing we don't have. So everything is inference from what we do have. It's inference as to, from the level of, well, we have this tool so we can infer that certain kinds of work were being done. And then the step beyond that, well, what was the value of the work that was being done, or what were the conditions under which this work was being done? And every sort of step is a step beyond that on this sort of ladder of inference to try and understand, and we try to contextualize it as best we can, which is part of the reason why, for me in particular, it's not just about doing the site work, but it's about collecting oral histories, and it's about going into the archives. You need as much contextualization as possible. But this very aspect of doing archaeology, some people, it's like a Rorschach test. Some people are just frightened by the idea that we would be taking a stone tool or a piece of potsherd and building these inferences about meaning and value and practice from it, almost as if we can't leap into that realm. And then there's other people who think that is just the most fantastic thing about what we do, is exploring the possibilities of how could this have been meaningful. I had an advisor at Berkeley who talked in those terms, instead of that our job was not to necessarily think about why specifically, but how possibly could this have been meaningful? Because we're never going to get at that why specifically. It's unless you get a plaque that says, I, Peter Shea, took this camera and used it to do X, Y, and Z, and it meant this to me. People just don't do that. So, although you should think about that, right? In a way, you're leaving your own record, but I imagine it probably changes through time, what it means to you, what this work means to you, and so you'd have to keep updating that record. So yeah, that is, and that opens up all those additional doors for why the more collaborative we can make our work, the better, the more meaningful it is for people today. And that's really what it comes down to is, why would we do this? Why would we dig up sites if it wasn't meaningful to somebody today. So so we should be engaging with all those different perspectives on what meaning is. So
I think of my dad coming back from the war. He left when they were farming with horses.
mm-hmm.
He came back when tractors were pretty much established and bought a pair of horses. Were a total disaster. It made an enormous mess, and he had to sell them. But, I mean, that fact, horses were so important, he wasn't willing to let them go. And the worst thing you could do was criticize somebody's horse.
Mm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
their favorite team.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of, I mean, there's something, it's worth recovering. It's weird. It's not really imaginable. The attitude we have towards riding horses these days is not the same.
Right, yeah.
And that's, but I'm wondering how you think about it, you know, sort of preliminary closure. I mean, if what you're up to is thinking about how these things could be spun together.
Mm-hmm.
Did he love his horses or did he hate his horses?
Yeah.
Probably the answer is both.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Right.
with a preponderance of love,
Mm-hmm.
at least at one point. But, you know, as you're working, when do you say you're finished?
Yeah, that's a good question. When in some ways when the most immediate purpose is served. I mean, and there are certain kinds of sites where people will keep going back to and reopening and or revisiting collections. One of my colleagues in the department here, Peter Wells, who almost all of his work for the last several decades has been revisiting the collections of sites that were excavated in the early 20th century or the late 19th century. I mean, he's working with things that have been out of the ground for quite some time, but there's always kind of ways to rethink what they mean. So it's closed when you feel like the question is answered as well as you can, or for whoever it is who's asking the question, in that fashion. But there, you know, it's a little bit that becomes a little tricky with archaeology because, you know, with an archive, things are collected and they are always accessible to go, you know, and look at and reread and so on and so forth. And artifacts can act in the same fashion, but sites themselves cannot, because when we excavate a site, we literally destroy it. So you can never excavate a site more than once. You can do portions of it, but you know, when that site is completely open and every last scrap of dirt and artifact is removed, then you're left with what the durable record is to make interpretations of, reinterpretations of after that. So I guess there's several different answers to that question of, you know, part of it has to do with the questions that we bring to bear, but part of it also has to do with the nature of the material that we're working with, and sites themselves are something that we can only kind of address, can look at for a limited period of time. We have a pretty strong conservation ethic within archaeology for that very reason, knowing that it can only be excavated once. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it brings up an area of ignorance of mine, as usually these interviews do. When you go to excavate a site, do you start with a question?
Yes, sometimes the question is, what's here?
Okay.
Yeah. People generally think about, especially in American archaeology, there are a couple different ways in which we approach it. Academic archaeology is generally thought of as problem-oriented, which means that you do have a question in mind before you approach the site. But probably 90% of the archaeology done in the United States is actually triggered by federal or state law, compliance to federal and state laws, such that they're covered under sites are covered under preservation law. So if a building is going to be built, or a road, or whatever it is, and there's some kind of federal or state money involved, usually that triggers archaeological survey to make sure that there isn't anything there that's going to be destroyed or negatively impacted by the work that's going to be done. So the question, that's where the question comes in of what's here, and then the question after that becomes, how significant is it? And that's a value-laden question, of course. But that question has to be asked because frequently we have to make the decision, do we take it out and allow the project to continue, or do we move the project? And so even in those compliance cases, the issue of value and question comes up pretty frequently. So, but that's a great question. I mean, yes, generally speaking, I think that we always approach the site with a question in mind first. That was not always the case in American archaeology. People would just kind of go and say, we're going to open everything, and whatever is there, the data will speak to us. And we've since come to realize that was a kind of a silly approach to things. Data does not speak. It can be interpreted, but there are wrong ways to excavate sites, and so you better have a question in mind before you go.
So if I get you right, the deal is something like this. You're not going to work effectively unless you have a question, but the fact that you get to do it and not somebody, say, 30, 40 years from now means that your question is in some ways the only question that's going to get to be asked of the site, because what you do will either destroy the site or will decide that the site wasn't worth preserving and the bulldozers will go through, or whatever.
Yep.
And so, to some extent, your responsibility is to preserve information that's off to the side of the question you want to ask, in case there's some, because you have this sort of privilege of being the only person who'll ever ask a question of that site.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, if you can't work in a focused way, you're not going to get anything interesting out of your digging.
Yeah. It's a tremendous responsibility. So with research design, you have to consider, is there a way in which we can preserve and document things, even if it doesn't necessarily address the immediate questions that we have, but that somebody might want to ask down the line. Just as an example, I'm not a sort of a specialist in botanical remains, but there are certain archaeologists who do paleoethnobotany. They are interested in plant remains in particular. It can tell you a lot about foodways, about the environment, questions like this. But it requires a very particular kind of sampling strategy to collect soil in which you might see micro remains. So you might build into your strategy, even though I'm not going to look at these samples, we will collect them and archive them, and at some point in the future somebody may want to ask questions of it. But there's always that calculation of, am I collecting enough? Is it going to answer the questions? What kinds of conditions do I need to keep those samples under? And we don't always get it right. So, and there's always new techniques that we can't anticipate coming forward. But it's a real responsibility in a way that I think a lot of other historical scholarship does not necessarily have to deal with. Although I imagine people who are archivists have the same problem, right? You bring a collection to an archive and say, we'd like to preserve this in the long term, and they only have so much space, and so they make decisions about, we're going to keep this material, but we're not going to keep that material because we're not interested in it. And it gets destroyed. Nobody else can look at that in the future. So there is something to that, but yeah, it is one of the real peculiarities to archaeology that other historical scholarship does not have to deal with, I think.
Do you think have a sort of personal value profile? What I mean is, we bring you in to a situation, and the question is this site valuable? Or can we bulldoze it? Or can we build a skyscraper on it? Or can we alter it in certain ways that make it a whole lot more convenient for us, but lose certain values? And I mean, I'm sure there are vague things in all the statutes to determine guidance, and I'm also sure they're vague, because if they were specific, they would have resulted in such fights that the statutes had never been passed.
Yep.
So where's your heart on this? You come to a site, I mean, I think about the site I care about most, which is a church about 2 miles from here. Was part of the liberal Catholic Church revival, so to speak. Isn't quite old enough for historic preservation. Losing it would be there would be something you wouldn't know if it got lost. But I can think of 100 other things that could be described the same way. Where's value for you? Where's the what do you feel this has to be preserved?
Well, in a lot of ways, that it's somebody has to express an interest in preserving it. Somebody has to declare that there's value in that. What I can do is step in and say, this is what we have. Here are some of the communities that you probably should be consulting with to ask whether there is value in keeping it or not. And yes, there is that sort of legal framework to kind of guide that to begin with a little bit. But, that there's this sort of competing urge, and sometimes I see this with students too, of keep everything, preserve everything, because you never know when somebody's going to want to ask questions of that. And, I understand that, because there are many questions that we ask today of sites that nobody would think was even remotely interesting 100 years ago, for a variety of reasons. But on the other hand, I also know that there are particular kinds of sites that people think, this should be preserved for its formal qualities, or because it represents, this kind of situation in history. There's sort of a classic example of industrial sites, factory sites, for example, and people saying, those who actually may have worked in the factory, for example. And I'm not going to remember where the case was, but I read this case study at some point where somebody said, my father worked in that factory for 50 years, and it made him miserable, and I don't understand why you want to leave this building standing. So in some respects, part of the conflict is also understanding that there's a need to forget too. We don't need to remember everything, and sometimes the need to forget is very strong, and we need to listen to that as well. And most often people will express it by simply not showing up to say anything about the site. But when you go to them, listening very seriously to them, saying, this has no value, or it has negative value to me, and I don't see the need to preserve it. So those kinds of expressions on both sides of, both positive and negative are the things that we try to, as you say in the example of something that does not fit the criteria for being, whatever it is, the 50-year rule. Has to be at least 50 years old for it to fall under historic preservation laws. But there are other kinds of recourses that we can take if something is really truly valuable to a community. There's actually a sort of subsection of the historic preservation laws that covers traditional cultural places. And for the most part, this is a rule that is implemented by Native communities, But the reality is this is actually open to any community. If there is some place on the landscape that you want to demonstrate has traditional cultural value to you, that you may have preservation recourse through that. But it's up to people to say, this has value to me. We can't, it's just not possible to preserve everything, on the off chance that someday, and part of me feels like, why would we want to do that? I almost feel like we talked a little bit before the interview started about, when is history sort of constructed? Is it history is in the making all the time? In some ways, we almost need distance before historical narratives can really cohere and have that significance. Some scholars talk about there being a need for a rupture between the past and the present. There has to be the rupture for something to be past for it to acquire that kind of value, and it's something to think about. So,
but if I'm understanding you right, part of what you're saying is that you are in some way the servant of the contemporary activists. That is, that you can lay out the case once somebody has made a loud noise in favor of something. What you don't take on as a project is to talk about who might make a noise, or who would have made a noise, or could have made a noise, or should be making a noise.
Yeah. I could make that case. I mean, in some respects, sort of making the case that that this site represents a unique and now irretrievable perspective on the past. That's actually covered by preservation law, and historic preservation and archaeology actually fall under the same legal umbrella where that's concerned. But those are actually the easier cases to make, because this is something that this is the only recourse we have to this particular type of history, this perspective on history. So therefore it needs to be preserved, because nobody is speaking for it. There is no descendant community who can speak to it. That's, I think, in some respects almost easier. But when it comes to looking at something that represents, there may be multiple examples of it. You have to build the case that there are particular reasons why those are worth preserving when there are 18 other examples of it.
So uniqueness counts hugely then.
It does. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it does. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the I'm not sure how I feel about that?
Well, from uniqueness we sort of slide into these other discussions about things like authenticity or singularity, or that I don't know. I mean, uniqueness sometimes just because there's only one of something, I don't know. I mean, this sort of, I'm very ambivalent about this, that I'm going to fall back on the terms that archaeologists very often use to classify themselves. They talk about how you can either be a lumper or a splitter, right? So when you're classifying things, some people have a tendency to create broader categories, classifications, and push more things into those. They're lumpers. And splitters are the people who tend to see all the differences between everything. So you end up with a whole slew of categories that are all occupied by one. So sometimes it comes down to, how fine are you willing to split that distinction, to say that something is unique versus it's a variant of something else, or, and again, sometimes it's a matter of somebody sees it as unique and wants to make that argument, then okay, let's split. Sometimes nobody is gonna speak for it, or, you know, I hate to put it that way, but, and it makes me sound like a terrible archaeologist when I say there are certain things that we don't, you know, we can't save, and maybe it's not worth the effort to save, but, you know, that's sort of the, it's virtually impossible for us to save everything. So these are the decisions that we have to come down to making. So.
Well, what you're saying makes archaeology sound certainly very political.
Totally political.
And that's a surprise to me. I mean, I would have thought that it, to put it very baldly, that it had more professional backbone than that.
It has tremendous professional backbone, but and the reality is our sort of professionalism comes in the kind of range of training to recognize and be able to advise on a variety of different kinds of materials that not everybody is an expert on. But I would say, I actually think that if you're making a distinction between political and objectively professional, I don't see those two things as being sort of opposite. I think that what we can be professional, but part of being professional is recognizing the very political nature of the material that we work with.
Well, what I'm hearing, and I'm saying it back so that I get it right, what I'm hearing is that once you have a community consensus somewhere or other that says what it is we care about and what it is we don't care about, you can tell people whether this is an example of one of those things you care about or one of these things we don't care about. What you don't seem to be representing is a very strong, as it were, independent and alternative view about what you damn well should care about.
Well, and we can do that. I mean, what we often end up doing is saying, look, here's the site. Here are all of the reasons why this is connected to various different kinds of historical perspectives. It can tell us all kinds of things about this history or that history that we think is valuable. But ultimately, it's not up to us whether or not it gets saved. And part of the reason why is it's expensive. You know, and these are the choices that people have to make in terms of, are you going to, I mean, and this is part of the political rhetoric today, it's very much part of it, you know, are you going to stand in the way of something that could potentially be of great economic benefit to a community that really desperately needs it? Or are you going to say, no, you can't build this here. You can't bring these businesses here because there is this, 19th century farmstead that we think, has great value, so you shouldn't build here. It is not up to us to be the ultimate arbiters of what significance is. There has been a time in the past when we kind of viewed our role in that fashion, but it's really not. We can voice it as strongly as we can, though, and sort of, and often, I find often the case is people may be swayed by your argument, not because they didn't think that historical perspective was, they didn't find it insignificant before, and now they find it significant. It's usually because they simply didn't know it was there. And once they realize it, they say, oh, well, that's something that we should preserve.
But now, if I'm understanding you right, the sort of argument you tend to be making is this artifact or this site or this building connects to an existing constituency that wants it, that if they knew these 14 facts about it, would very much want it to be here or to continue. Is that right?
In some cases, yeah. It's a matter of saying, based on what we found, there is perhaps a constituency that you have not considered when making those decisions. We can do that. We can, we can try to, if that constituency, say there are no descendants of that constituency that we can make an appeal to, we can make the appeal based on, isn't there some way to value the multiplicity of one's past, even though the contemporary community is not multiple, and see if people find that of value. But, this is the reality that archaeology has just always been a very, very political. Let's put it this way. I'll give you the worst possible example. Nazi Germany had a really thriving archaeology program in the service of building a narrative about the German past that was based on sort of finding and identifying sort of the true German spirit that was found in these various different locations, to the exclusion of various different, we don't want to be reliant on the Roman or the Greek past to assign significance. There is this sort of, and it was used for sort of terrible ends. It was the way that they did the archaeology, their technique was wonderful. It was great. The interpretations are where it really caused huge amounts of problems. So, so that's something that we, I don't know. I just think that any archaeologist who doesn't think in those terms, not that we're combating Nazi interpretations, but anybody who thinks that what they find in the ground is just sort of has objective value is kind of fooling themselves. It really. It's the interpretations have meaning for different people in different ways, and we can't sort of say what that significance is. We can only sort of suggest this is what we found, and here are the ways that it might be significant. So,
I was actually thinking of the next generation of the Nazi example, which is the Nazi buildings in Munich.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Allies did everything they could to destroy Munich. Mm-hmm. And then the followers, the governments that followed it a certain amount, but there are some Nazis built piles. Mm-hmm. It's really difficult to get rid of them. And there are some things which are on the monumental, in the monumental space, which are old Nazi buildings now parceled out among things like the art history department at the university. I think maybe archaeology has its institute in the old Nazi spaces. Mm-hmm. And I mean, of all the things I was concerned to take pictures of, I was most concerned to take pictures of those buildings. Mm-hmm. Because I was most concerned to understand what Hitler would have done if he'd gotten a chance to redo Berlin. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they preserve, as it were, the first step to the rebuilding of Munich in a way that a bunch of people in Bavaria would like to see it rebuilt. Uh-huh. Without any of those pesky foreigners or Jews or anything but decent Aryans. Yeah. And I think those examples are kind of the place where, to some extent, the rubber hits the road about preservation, especially when there aren't a whole lot of Nazi buildings left. Yeah. Yeah. And you say, well, this is in some sense unique. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, why there are certain places, again, sort of going back to that example of, there are some places that people, if you'd asked immediately after the fact, should we be preserving the former sites of concentration camps? I'm sure the overwhelming response would have been, reduce it to rubble, get rid of it. But those are sites, preserved sites today. They have a particular kind of historic valence and value, and people, they're not happy sites, but they're preserved. It is sort of chance, though. It's on the flip side, the Japanese incarceration camps from World War II in this country most of them, even though they are all marked as national landmarks today, the structures are gone. They were not sort of considered to be worth preserving in any fashion at the time. And so people really engage with them as ruins now. So, that's kind of the interesting thing about archaeology itself is we're also dealing mainly with sites that, we don't deal a whole lot with standing architecture. So the sites already have been through a process where somebody decided it was not worth keeping, and then for us to come back in and say, well, we need to preserve the grounds that somebody already walked away from and said, this is not worth keeping. But interestingly, there are, so I'll give you an example from the Southwest where there are projects, I can't remember the official name of the ethnohistory project, but working with representatives of the Hopi Nation, some Arizona archaeologists have gone to a variety of different sites that are generally considered to be ruins, right? They are the kind of, they're not standing architecture, they are just the sort of remains, the rubble, often just trash piles, things like that, of Pueblo sites dating to, say, 11th, 12th century. And the Hopi informants, the folks who were, the collaborators who were involved in this project, as well as a number of other indigenous sort of archaeologists and collaborators, have really resisted this term of abandonment, because people talk about, they lived in this area and then they abandoned it. And they say, this is not abandoned. It is an area that we lived in once. We moved to another area. But to say that it's abandoned implies that it has no meaning or connection to us anymore. And it does. And they actually talked about how the ruins themselves are markers left by the ancestors, almost like memorials, as markers to mark their history, to give people something to remember with, which I find a really beautiful way of thinking about ruins. Makes us think differently about archaeological sites. So makes it. But would we know that without talking to those descendant communities? Absolutely not. So.
Yes. Nobody goes into the Rockefeller estate to exhume.
Right, yeah.
Here's a house you haven't used for 50 years. Let's dig a hole.
Right, yeah.
Thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you.